Welcome back, colleagues. Thank you for being with us promptly. Hopefully you've had a chance for a bit of a break and switch off from staring at your screen and get active. I know Mark's done 14 laps around his garden. So on we go. So we're on to community leadership and the 21st century public servant. So I'd like to welcome Professor Catherine Needham, who's joined us from the University of Birmingham, and is going to lead us through this next bit of conversation. Hopefully get you thinking about different roles, different ways of working, some really good ties with some of the conversations we had earlier about who's got the resource, how do we access the resource, how do we influence where it is, how do we listen to those different voices, and tackle some of those system-wide issues. So Catherine, over to you.
Hi all, really delighted to be here with you today, talking about the research that we did around, really very much around that sort of community leadership role in the 21st century public servant. So I've got some slides to show to you to get the conversation started around this. They're very visual slides. We work with an artist to produce them based on the research findings. So hopefully there'll be plenty there for you to look at and engage with. So this was a piece of work that was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, where we looked at changing local public service systems and spoke to people, did interviews with people working in local public services, which we define broadly as local government, police, fire, health, a range of different public service organisations, including those delivered by outsourced organisations, so the third sector and private sector. And we also did a survey with people who were on the National Graduate Development Programme run by Local Government Association, just to see what their kind of vision was for how local authority and broader public service roles were changing. So I'm going to share with you the findings of that and some associated pieces of work in this session. And I've built in some pause points where I just really want to get your thoughts on how this is resonating with the kinds of thinking that you're doing more broadly in the programme about what it means to be a community leader and what we're calling here a 21st century public servant working across that local public system really, and that much broader landscape. So having done the research, we got on the road and have been sharing it. So there's lots of detail on here, and I guess the detail is not so important as the sense that this has been a kind of an ongoing conversation. So we didn't do the research and then sort of just put it out there as a static thing. We produced a website, we've been doing blogs, we've been involving lots of people in that. We've been working with the Local Government Association, who've been one of our partners on the 21st century public servant, and been running events to get people to think about the different kind of roles and skills and values that are needed by the workforce. In the bottom left, you can see there some of the things that local authorities said when we did an evaluation of how people had been using the work, talking about building into the DNA of the organisation, different values and behaviours, changes in working practices, and then kind of thinking about their values differently. And part of it has also been embedding it in some of the key programmes in the sector. So I've mentioned the NGDP already, but also aspiring directors of public health, which is obviously closely related in a way to what we're doing here today, and the total leadership programme that's run by Solace as well. When we were first on the road, because we've shared this work with lots of different organisations, particularly local government, we were chatting to officers who said, I like the research and it really resonates, but what about the elected members? Are they on board? Is this the kind of local authority that they want to be working with? So we also did an associated piece of work around the 21st century councillor, which I'll mention a little bit today as well. So to interview elected members about how they see their own role developing over the period. And then much more recently, we then thought, well, clearly the COVID-19 pandemic is making all sorts of changes to local government, what in the height of the crisis, what people were doing in their day job, but more broadly about how we work and where we work and the kinds of relationships we have with communities. So we've also done an associated piece of work around COVID-19 or keeping the windows open, which I'll mention today as well. So as I said, I'll take you through different bits of the research, but we've got various pause points because it's very much wants to be a conversation rather than just me kind of talking through what we found. So one of the key elements at all the different points of our research and all the different projects has been this notion of what we call perma austerity. That for those of us working in public services in perhaps the New Labour era, there was a time when the graph was going up. There was more money being spent, but that's now pretty ancient history now, and most of us are much more familiar with a graph that's going down, or is at best static. And with the pressures around the cost of living crisis and the way that the inflationary pressures are affecting local government and broader public services, we know that this context of perma austerity might be with us for some of us for a lot of our working lives, really, in that local public service context. So what we were wanting to have a conversation about really is the extent to which we can get away from the picture on the left to something on the right, maybe not as far as the rainbow where everything is kind of sorted, but might we at least be in a kind of a shared boat with a shared sense of where this smaller, more agile strategic organization is going? Could we be under a shared umbrella with our partners and key other actors in our local service systems, so that there is a kind of a narrative around what local government is for in an era where it will continue to be one of intense financial pressures and very limited scope for expansion. And also, I think changes in what citizens expect from us as senior leaders within public services. So, you know, it may be a long time since that sort of decline of deference. Kind of arguments have been made that because something is said to you by a professional doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to believe it and take it on board. But nonetheless, I think there's been all sorts of newer challenges as well around challenges around the extent to which we're working co-productively with communities, to think about some of the key issues that they're facing, and to recognise the expertise that's there within communities as well. That kind of notion of being experts by experience means that we need to think much more about doing things with people rather than to them. So bringing in a much broader set of knowledge and ideas and skills from our community partners and from citizens themselves. Some of that will be through new technologies as well, in terms of the ways that people want to connect with us. And so that's an important thing to be kind of part of this conversation. How are citizens getting in touch with us, and what other kind of mechanisms we have for responding to things in a timely way? And there's also clearly a kind of piece here around inequalities. So we know that some citizens maybe want to be very involved, want to get in touch, want to work co-productively, but they may not be the communities and the citizens that we really want to be having those conversations with, who we really feel that their voices are lacking in terms of representation within our communities and some of our services. So it's thinking then differently about kind of how we might engage with some of that kind of broader body of citizens. And this was also a feature of the councillor work, as you can imagine. So a lot of sense from councillors that they want to, that citizens are developing different expectations of them, that these are coming through different kind of media channels. So the kind of social media context has dramatically changed over the last decade or so, feeling that people expect them to be an oracle and to be available 24/7. And clearly that has a bearing then on the kinds of demands that elected members are making on senior managers and others within the organisation. And so I'm sure that's a context that you'll be familiar with as well. So that's just a very initial kind of flavour of some of the issues that were coming out of the research. I'm going to pause there so that we can get started on this kind of conversation really around some of these things, which is to think about how are you facing some of those challenges around residents within the community, about how they want to communicate with you as a council and the sorts of things that they want from you, and to what extent have you got the right tools and mechanisms in place to have those conversations. So kind of what's the current situation and what would you like to do better around responding to how children and families want to communicate with you and with the broader local authority. So I'm going to just pause for some thinking time, and then the chat is open and you can also put your hand up just to get some initial sort of thoughts and comments on that question. Ashley, I'll come to you then as a quick thinker.
So I think I'm Ashley Whittaker. I work in Richmond and Kingston in southwest London. I think we've been on a bit of a journey with this around when we tried to take engaging with our communities more seriously. It was kind of expected that lots of people would just do it in addition to their day job. And I think we realised over time that it was something which, to do it properly, takes actually a lot of time. And actually quite a lot of expertise as well, particularly with certain communities, and it was unrealistic to just bolt it onto people's jobs and expect them to do it on top of everything else. And so we were able to get a little bit more of funding to have some dedicated posts to do it, and I think that's helped us go in the right direction. But it needed a kind of acceptance that if we were going to do this properly, we needed to take it seriously. We needed to invest in it to make it work. We're nowhere near where we want to be, because what would we like to do better? I think there are certain communities which are definitely underrepresented. Single parent families, for example, certain ethnic groups, but also certain religious communities who have different views about wanting to engage with children's services. And each of them requires a kind of bespoke approach to make sure that we can be empathetic and engage with them successfully. So still work in progress. And I think the point really is that to do it properly, one has to accept that it takes time and investment.
Thanks, Ashley. And I wonder as well if there's a kind of question about whether the channels that we offer to people are the channels that they want to use. Because I know we have withdrawn various kinds of kind of face-to-face channels, and that maybe I wonder if that's something that you're encountering. Kevin?
I think for while working in Kent, it's definitely been raised by the Send Revisit, how challenging it is to engage with families about what they want. We're especially looking forward to the white paper around SEND so we can get a bit more meat on the bones. But essentially, we've got really poor communication with families, and it's become such a big beast with the HCPs that got nearly, I think it's nearly 20,000 HCPs, and there's only so much resource you can put into it. And I think we're not communicating at all with the families to help them understand what actually inclusion is, and we're not doing a good enough job of telling schools either about inclusion. So we've been asking ourselves corporately, do we understand it, and trying to redefine it and do a bit more engagement work around trying to create new spaces, and then we can try and help schools with that, with our responsibility to think about inclusion a lot more better than we are, to help kids stay mainstream really when we know they have better outcomes. And I think the biggest challenge is that we've given the survey, we've given provisions for such a long time now, then trying to take it away is impossible. And the biggest problem we got now is trying to communicate with families to say we were wrong in the first place. Your child can be managed in mainstream, and we need to help each other to understand what inclusion means, and to know that their kids can stay in mainstream, and to help schools understand they can do a little bit more differently. Not more, but they can do something differently to try and keep them there. So, yeah, I mean, Ofsted as well, I've met with Ofsted recently, and they acknowledge that they've given 94% of schools in Kent good or outstanding. So that can't be right if we've got such a big problem about inclusion. So they've just said to us that things are probably going to have to change, and they've got to learn themselves, Ofsted, as to what they're regulating really. What's the emphasis on what they regulate if inclusion's so wrong? And there's such a big challenge in Kent, they haven't given the right messages through making 94% of schools good and outstanding. So we're working with Ofsted to understand what their journey is and doing that together. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. That's really interesting. And I think that point there about having to have different conversations with families that, that might, that to on one reading look like something's being taken away, but trying to, have that kind of different conversation about, in this case, inclusion. Any other thoughts around this question of kind of channels and how to get the channels right? Chris?
Yeah, I'm coming from the other side of the table, so to speak, because I'm in the voluntary sector. And so a lot of the conversations I'm having is about the second part of that. What would look better, and what's the conversation? So I'm a firm believer in how you weave in the conversation into the mainstream of the council as opposed to one department. So you could be looking at issues around housing or issues around the physical environment of a community, and how is that communicated. It shouldn't be done just through children's services, because they don't have the barometer or the skill set, like Kevin just mentioned, to be able to deliver that conversation. So the question really is about who's best placed to communicate that message, that question, that appreciative inquiry, who's best to do that. And it isn't always children's services. So it's about recognizing where the strengths lie in the community. And if it is an opportunity to commission services to be able to get that message across, then the local authority, children's services, chief executive department can look at that differently. And it's about weaving in, it's like we said earlier on today, about how you weave in different conversations to different parts of the system to be able to galvanize a particular point. So in the borough where I am, in Northwest London, there's a big issue around contested histories and some of the street names and how they became the names that they are. And there was a little bit of pushback about who's best to ask the question. And that becomes quite a contentious issue in of itself. So does a local authority ask the question to have a name changed or a name of a school changed because of its history and connection to slavery? Or is it something else? Who does that? Who does that positioning? So for me, the question is, how do you engage? What routes do you use to engage with a variety of different communities? And then what is the end point? What's the purpose of that engagement? So it can vary, but I don't think it sits solely with children and families, but they are part of that fabric.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. So it's about making sure that this is much more broader and kind of system-wide conversation, and kind of the right people having the right conversation, thinking about whose role it is to do some of these things. Okay, we'll move on then to thinking, because that connects really well, I think, to thinking about the kind of the roles and the skills and the careers that we want to be having within that broader kind of public service landscape. So these, on the slide here, you can see some of the roles that people talk to us about when we ask them what they were doing in local public services. So some of these, like a commissioner, are fairly well known. You might find those on a job description, perhaps even in a broker, but some of the others are not generally things you would find on a job description, but were the way that people were kind of doing their own sense making around the roles that they were doing within local government. So the idea of being a storyteller, which was kind of working with the people who were coming into the service or who you were working with in the community to kind of think about the stories that they were telling about their own lives and how those might develop in different kinds of directions in ways that were helpful and holistic. Thinking about being a resource weaver, so back to that notion of kind of perma-austerity, that the local authority won't necessarily be the people bringing the money, or certainly not all coming from one service, that it might be about thinking creatively about knitting resources, or perhaps bringing them together in a different kind of way in order to provide that kind of holistic support, which isn't just about children's services, but maybe about the broader kind of employment and housing context in which a family face themselves, and recognising the community resources, which may not be cash resources, but other kinds of resources that are available in the community to support people. That notion of being a system architect, I think, is about increasingly this sense of being able to work across that broader local public service system, which may have partners, health, parts of the voluntary sector, housing providers, that you need to be able to think about the kind of the system architecture that really affects people's lives. And for many people, the kind of the organizational titles are not important so much as the kind of what that adds up to in terms of their own kinds of experiences. This notion of being a navigator, I think, is a really important one for people working in public services, a recognition that we may never, I think, solve the maze or the complexity of public services, that the kind of the notion that we can kind of slim everything down by, I don't know, integrating health and social care, for example, we will not, I think, solve that complexity. But what we can do is act as navigators for people through the maze to kind of help them understand how to make it work better for them. And that links to being that sense of kind of a networker, linking people to those resources, which may be about community assets as much as about kind of formal public service delivery. And then, so this notion, I think, of being a kind of municipal entrepreneur pulls all of that together, a sense of kind of how are you working creatively, how are you working maybe at the kind of the edges of your formal job description and the kinds of things that are formally within your remit, to think much more about how you connect people up, do that networking, do the kind of navigation and think about bringing resources together in that different way. And then a recognition that if we want people to be doing that, then we need to be recruiting and rewarding people with the skills in order to do that. So we will always need people with the skills on the right-hand side of the graph, of the image. People will always need we need a finance team and a legal team, somebody to do the contracting, and that some of those are what we might call kind of hard skills, in the sense that people often perhaps bring particular professional qualifications in those, but that actually the kinds of things that we want to be doing in terms of creating different kinds of relationships with partners and with communities and families is an awful lot about this, the stuff that's on this side, on the left-hand side of the slide, around what we sometimes call soft skills. So the kind of the interpersonal relationship building, empathy, synthesizing kinds of skills, which we often don't get from our professional training. We're not necessarily good at spotting them at the point of recruitment, and we don't always reward the people who've got them because they don't fit perhaps on formal job descriptions or job evaluations. But actually, and I think this perhaps was something Ashley was alluding to, if we want to have those different kind of conversations, we need to explicitly bring in people into the organisation who are good at that those sorts of roles, and we need to kind of ensure that the right kind of training is in place in order to do that. So in terms of some work we've done with the fire service, for example, there's a recognition, I'm sure it's true in your area as well, that what the job of the fire service is, to a much lesser extent, putting fires out. So they still need that stuff on the right-hand side about, you know, how do you tackle certain different kinds of fires, and what are some of the kind of the immediate crisis response skills that are required. But actually, if your job now is increasingly a kind of public health, safe and well check kind of role, going into people's homes where there isn't a fire, but there is concerns about perhaps the well-being and kind of broader outcomes for a family, then you're going to need really quite different kinds of skills to get through the door. You know, it's not a command and control situation, and to build up the kind of rapport that you need. So some work we did with the West Midlands Fire Service was looking around the skills for doing the safe and well checks in people's homes, where they're asking people about their smoke alarms initially, but they're also asking about weight management, about debt, about mental health more broadly, and that lots of these are really quite difficult conversations to be starting when somebody thinks you're initially in their house to sort out their smoke alarms. So that real kind of recognition of the need to be thinking differently about who's coming into the service and how are they being supported, you know, and that can't just be a kind of an optional training course that people have to do on their day off. It's really going to be core to the work that's being done. And all that has to be done with an awareness of the kind of careers that people are having. So when we did the survey of people on the National Graduate Development Programme, very few of them were in local government for life. That wasn't where they saw their career kind of stretching out ahead of them. They were gathering what they saw as transferable skills that they wanted to take off and do other things with. So, you know, for when you're investing in a graduate training development program, you've got to, of course, be aware of the fact that you're equipping people for moving between careers, and thinking about different kinds of roles, and making sure that we're being alert to opportunities to give people the kinds of career development that they might want within the organisation, perhaps meaning that retention is better. So if people have got opportunities for secondments and sabbaticals, then maybe they won't leave the sector. They'll think about kind of different opportunities within it instead. And there are questions, of course, around how in these local public service system, what are kind of the ethics and values that we bring to it are. So for those working in the kind of core public sector, there has been a kind of a sense of a public service ethos, which is not about profit, it's about service and support. But that increasingly working with organisations that may come from a different kind of context, from a for-profit or not-for-profit context, perhaps faith groups, that there are different kinds of ethics and values in the mix, and that we have to be alert to those and to ensure that those are still delivering for our communities in ways that are appropriate. So we know that lots of care is for profit provision, for example, and that working with for-profit providers is an essential part of ensuring placements and opportunities for people that the council is responsible for, but thinking through carefully what the kind of ethical implications of that are in a way that really builds on, that builds what the public and communities need from public services. And so there's a lot there, I think, for people working in public services to deal with. A lot of that kind of more relational, empathetic, interpersonal ways of working creates different kinds of challenges. That some of the new ways of communicating, social media type channels of communication, are often about kind of presenting the authentic self, about not hiding behind kind of professional role boundaries, and clearly in the training you've had around working in children's services, this all has to be handled very carefully. But some of the people we were talking to were reflecting on, you know, my comms team are telling me that I need to be sort of authentic on Twitter or whatever, but I can't do that without risking saying something that the corporate team won't be happy with. So there's all sorts of kind of new challenges, I think, in addition to the existing ones around where we set our boundaries, who we are, and kind of how we make sure that we set time for that kind of reflective learning that needs to be done, and that, you know, I know you've had spaces on this program to do, but thinking about the kind of the personal boundaries and the way that they're maintained in a context where we might be interacting with citizens in different kinds of ways, and where being open and relational in our ways of working is increasingly seen as a vital part of our toolkit. So I'm going to pause again there for some thinking time and question, which is really about the balance between the kind of the specialist professional skills and then some of those generalist skills around the sort of soft skills of connecting, relating, generating those kind of good links with broader partners and communities, and thinking about how you recognize and reward those within your own teams and within the organization, and whether we've got the balance right really in terms of people with some of those more generalist skills versus the specialist skill set. So again, I'm going to pause, give you some thinking time, and then do put your hand up or put something in the chat in order to respond. We'll come to you and then to Ashley.
I think in our QA unit, we recognised you couldn't just have a QA unit of social workers. We had a lot of colleagues that were potentially historically teachers or psychologists, and early help mainly backgrounds, or and open access and youth justice background, and having that kind of diversity of experiences helped us to really sharpen our QA framework. And when they went to observe social workers, I think social workers initially were like, well, you're not a social worker, but it was about practice. We weren't measuring social standards or statutory duty, we're looking at practice. So I think how you give the message is that some people think a specialist role is about a qualification, but actually it's about a skill set, and it's about how you deliver that message. But I think part of the challenge is that when you try to reward specific skills, that's when it gets complicated, I think, because I think when you're consistent, the fact is social workers during COVID were the only ones that went out and did visits. The police didn't do visits and needed help. And so there is a bit of an interface of specialism where you have to acknowledge that there's a bit more of risk going on in certain roles. And that's what we found difficult to try and corporately manage, because corporately everyone was working hard. Everyone was working within their job description and working to the best of their ability, found it stressful, found it emotive, but actually there was something that's a risk that some specialist roles had to take on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kevin. Ashley and then Fiona.
I think that local authorities are generally getting better at being more open-minded about employing people with generalist skills and bringing people with non-traditional skills into roles where they recognise that they bring value. But I do think that in challenging financial situations, they're still perhaps seen too much as a bit of a nice to have, and that there's a default position to revert to people with specialist skills because issues around risk. They want someone with the specialist skills to manage those risks, and I think that is hindering progress in certain areas. But I think generally going in the right direction.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Fiona.
Yeah, it's similar to what both Kevin and Ashley have said, really, but just a slightly different take on it. So I think as well with the specialist skills, it might not necessarily be specialist to that role. So it could be specialist in another field that brings something additional. So you've got the general skills that would be applicable, but actually they've got a specialism in another area. So like Kevin was saying, around having, you know, teachers and social workers and a variety of different professionals, they've all got different areas of specialist expertise that actually weren't necessarily what was needed for that role, but they brought that specialist expertise with the general stuff to then make up a really good skill mix of the team. So I think it's about the mix within the team of those different types of specialist skills.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting when you've got different professionals working together. Yeah, thanks. And coming in the chat from Andrea about thinking about that it's really specialist skills that are in demand with the turnover of some senior leaders. And Andrea, I don't know if you perhaps want to just come on and comment about that. I wonder whether the point there is that specialists are harder to find than generalists.
Yeah, I think just looking at the chart earlier on, I think getting the combination between what we require in terms of the specialised service areas that we work in and then what we require in terms of generalist skills, I think it's really challenging. And I think it is about the fact that people don't remain in the systems and working within the systems for long periods of time. So when you get into senior leadership positions, you will have one but not all those options, and particularly depending on how you interview and what you're looking for, the actual direct experience of working in the service areas can be really limiting.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a nice to have kind of, yeah, if you can get it. And Andrea, just thinking about you were talking about turnover as well, do you want to just sort of reflect on that? Because I think that's really relevant to our conversation here.
Well, I think it is. And I think thinking about the next question in terms of reward and retaining people with those generalist skills, I think it's a real challenge, you know, in terms of the organisation we work in, social care in particular, social work. I mean, I find it really fascinating because I've recently recruited a senior leader who was a non-qualified social worker, and the response from internally has been quite significant. And when you think about the specialist skills and the generalist skills, actually, this person's quite extensively skilled in both of those areas, but they don't have a qualification. And we, I think in local authority, and I'm talking about social care in particular, we restrict ourselves really. And I think that bit about reward and retain links in with that as well, in terms of how we're opening up opportunities, or how we're making them attractive to people that come out of the sector or into the sector from other areas of profession. And this was a really interesting post. It could have been filled by a probation officer, a police officer, a health officer, but yet in social care there was a strong view that it would have to be a qualified social worker. And I think that's something about valuing specialist expertise, but recognising that generalist skills can actually be as critical and as important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's something important there about internal credibility, that sometimes the way we kind of establish internal credibility is through our professional identities and skill sets, and it may be that in the absence of that, then people are not so willing to accept the kind of the credibility that comes from having that really strong generalist skill set.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Chris, thanks for your comment in the chat as well about the need to get the blend. So I'll move on then to thinking about some of the kind of broader challenges within this space. And one that I'm sure will be very familiar to you is around the kind of working with elected members in ways that enable you to work in kind of the way that communities and families want you to work with them, that maybe have some of those more kind of generalist skills. So we know there's lots of kind of pressures around working differently, particularly in cash constrained organisations. That some of the moves to neighbourhood working, for example, that some local authorities have done, have kind of added to a sense of kind of blurring of kind of who speaks for the place. If you've got neighbourhood networks, and you've also got the local elected members speaking for the place. We're just doing some work around for the Local Government Association around refreshing their local leadership framework to try to strengthen the identities and skill sets of elected members as local leaders in their wards, and part of that is about ensuring that they've got a clear understanding of where some of these boundaries are between what they do and what some of the officers will be doing working in that locality. And I'm sure that's an area that you've got a particular sensitivity to through working in the local authority, and when working with partners, my sense is that that's something that partners sometimes struggle to get their heads around, is that they don't really understand what it means to work in a political organisation, and to have to be mindful of ensuring that the elected members are always kind of on the radar in terms of thinking things through, and that is a very distinctive skill set that you guys will bring from that role within the local authority, those of you who are working within local authorities. And there's something as well about thinking differently about organisations. So lots of us will be working in organisations that look like that hierarchy in the middle left. That's what the university looks like. It's what most local authorities look like. And there are lots of good reasons why things are organised in that kind of way. But we also know that it does lead to siloed working, to people being in distinctive directorates, that even if we try to have super directorates, let's just call it people or place, that still within those, it's that smaller silos remain, or that you end up with kind of a bigger set of problems that lead in time to trying to break it back down again into something a bit more manageable. And that some of the kind of key issues around supporting people around outcomes, some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier, being more holistic in supporting families, then actually they don't fit at all into these hierarchies. So there's a real challenge then to be thinking about how we move to something that is much more about collaboration, integration, thinking about task and finish type of teams around particular problems that allow us to kind of get access that shared understanding. It's what one of my colleagues calls sort of yes to the mess. Let's think about being fluid. Let's think about how we kind of push at the edges of what's possible, that kind of sense of asking for forgiveness, not permission, which is one of those blithe sayings that's a lot harder to do in practice perhaps, but nonetheless, it's about thinking creatively about working with partners across the whole system, and thinking about the ability to be generous, I think, in terms of what we give to those partners, and in terms of not always getting the credit back ourselves, in terms of not always getting the budget savings back ourselves. And that does require thinking system-wide, recognising that the way that systems tend to work is that you can't pull a lever and expect something to happen. It is much more about working in an emergent way, finding your way through with partners, and that there's a real distinctive skill set in that, which is not one that fits well with the kind of neat organisational chart on the left. And that the people who thrive in that are not the kind of hero leaders necessarily. I think the sort of sense of hero leadership was consigned to the bin a long time ago, but nonetheless, I think we kind of can't quite let it go, because when a crisis comes along, when a pandemic comes along, we do want to still look, I think, to the leaders who are going to help us find our way through it. But on the whole, I think we're all kind of familiar with concepts like distributed leadership, collaborative leadership, that actually the leaders of the future, the people that you will be as you go into director roles, will be the people who are able to share responsibility and power, who are willing to be humble, to accept mistakes, to be much more kind of much more human leaders perhaps than the kind of hero leaders that we might have expected in the past, people who can understand that complexity can't be solved, but it can be kind of ameliorated and worked through, and that we need to be thinking about not doing two communities, but empowering them, working co-productively, recognizing existing resources in order to enable communities to find their own ways through many of the problems that people are encountering. And that we're doing that in places where there are different kind of scales at work. So we know that the neighborhood has become a kind of, has always been a kind of probably one of the key points of identity for the families and communities that we work with. Maybe in COVID-19 that became even more important because people were spending a lot more time in their neighborhood, perhaps people who've been historically been out and about in another kind of broader community. We know that the kind of regional agenda, combined authorities agenda will be very live in some of your areas, and that will be reshaping what is the right scale for thinking about some of these conversations and for thinking about some of the issues that you're facing in your day jobs, that they may now be dealt with on more of a kind of a regional or a city region kind of basis, rather than just being the sort of jurisdiction of the city council or the county council. So thinking differently about the scale of issues and thinking about our own kind of links to that. So some of us will live in the places that we work and we will be citizens of those places. Some will kind of come in for work and go away again and have a slightly different kind of relationship. So it's recognizing our own kind of engagement with what happens in our places as well as being kind of an important part of that, the sort of strategic leadership. And that's really about that ability to think about leading for the place, to thinking about beyond the local authority boundaries, to thinking about what's going on in this local system. You know, the thinking with obviously with the growth of integrated care systems, that's being much more kind of formally, structurally embedded. But we know that there's lots of players that need to be part of thinking place-wide around housing and employment and creating the kind of street communities and settings that we want. And so we all need, outside our kind of that kind of core everyday set of tasks, to be thinking, what does it mean for us to be system leaders and what does it mean for us to be leaders of place? So I'm going to pause again on that question. And thinking about the extent to which you feel you've got the right kind of skills and the time and the capacity to be thinking whole system, and what might the kind of some of the challenges of that be, and what might that mean for how you're thinking about your own kind of and your team's skills and roles as you develop your careers. So again, I'll just pause there for a few minutes to give people a bit of thinking time, and then do put your hand up or put something in the chat. Thanks, Avrili.
Hi, thank you. It's a really good question, because I've been asking this question recently, I guess, even in my own team. So I am the director of education, and of course, as you know, we have all sorts of funding, even within children's services. So you have your grant funding, and you have your general fund, and you have your DSG for education, and even that has high needs and non high needs. Then there's traded income. I mean, the list is long. And you know, whenever I sit in these meetings and you hear about the pressures on children's services budget, and I'm thinking, hello, I'm bringing in my DSG, you know, and my general fund isn't overspent, and although send transport and EPs are extortion. But you know, there's so many. I had a meeting with finance the other day, and I was saying, is it possible, you know, to just separate the conversations? And I guess if I was to think about it from a DCS's point of view, you do need to have that oversight. You do need to have some understanding of all your and I'm specifically focusing obviously on budgets here, the different pressures. But I think the question is, and I don't know the answer, so maybe you'll answer it, is how do you respond to those pressures in a way that is bespoke, or do you just take one system approach? And I don't know, because part of me wants to be part of the wider conversation, but I'm kind of thinking I have my own traded income targets to get to. Nobody's talking about that, but if I don't, I can't fund my team because we keep talking about place funding and the overspend there, you know? So I don't know is the question, and I'm almost not answering the question, but I think it has to start from the point of understanding. And when we use the word pressure, understanding that pressure is very different for different aspects of the system. And maybe I guess it goes back to trusting leaders to respond to those in a way that is appropriate and keeping that strategic overview without having to necessarily get involved. I don't know if I'm answering the question. I've just created more problems. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right that, I mean, trust is a huge part here because it's about sharing and it is about potentially putting yourself on the line when you've got your own budget to manage. So I think you're absolutely right that it's about trust and therefore thinking about what are some of the mechanisms for building trust. Nisha.
I think it's a whole system leadership it's complex, but really exciting, I find, because it's about understanding, it's about first developing a common vision and a common goal within a set timescales. That's my understanding all of this that I'm going to talk about. And then making sure that people are on board with that goal and that vision where we want to get to as a whole system. Then understanding, like really saying, mine is, yes, there is a whole pressure, budgetary or a, timescales or priorities pressure, but I want to focus on my own. So I think as a system leader, we need to understand each other's pressures, have a genuine appreciation for each other's pressures, and trying to find those codependencies where we can help each other and where we may not be able to help each other, but we understand that it is a codependency and we just have to live with it. So it's a lot of soft skills. I don't think this is where, when we were talking about soft and hard skills or specialist and generalist, I mean, generalist sounds quite demeaning. I think those are very important skills. And these days you can't find blooming specialists and they cost a lot and deliver very little, I feel. So you really need a good match of generalist and specialists, and we need to find a better word for generalist, but whatever. And those skills are really important for the whole system leadership. But I think that trust, that understanding and genuine appreciation for each other's roles, responsibilities, pressures is key. Otherwise, we are talking a lot, but probably not achieving a lot, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Nisha. I think there's lots of great stuff there. I think that point about genuine appreciation, I mean, certainly in the work that I've done, which has been around integrated health and care teams, I think too often there is a kind of hierarchy there that to some extent social care feels that this is an NHS agenda and that they're kind of being expected to kind of fall in with. And in children's services, which I'm not so familiar with, but I'm sure there's a similar kind of sense of the hierarchy of kind of whose agenda are we all kind of jumping to here, and that really gets in the way of clearly of that kind of genuine appreciation, trust, in order to kind of work together across the whole system, and particularly where there are budgets involved. So yeah, I completely recognise that, and I think it's about sort of not necessarily saying that we're going to kind of come together and we're going to solve these problems, because maybe lots of the kind of the issues around I mean, sort of getting somebody out of hospital, for example, would be obviously in adult social care would be a key factor. They're not easily solved, but it's about kind of what can we do to kind of come together to maybe think about the problem differently, to start at a different point, to think about much more kind of preventative type work, which might be about working with a whole different set of partners and agencies around prevention, so that the kind of crisis issues that we're facing here that are really pushing pressure on budgets can maybe be ameliorated earlier on in the process, for when we're thinking about avoiding getting here again. Okay, so move then on to the sort of final segment of the conversation, which is around the pandemic. So clearly working through the last 3 years or so has been a very unique, challenging, and for some people traumatizing period in terms of their working lives and their personal lives and all of the things that happened to us all over that period. And so I wanted to spend this last part of the session thinking about kind of how it's changed the nature of work and how it really changes the ways that you might think about yourselves and your kind of yourself as in terms of your own kind of identities and the challenges that you want to take on in your careers. And I think what we found through the research was that some of the things that we've been talking about were shifting. So I think there was perhaps a sense of wanting to look to a hero leader to kind of do the sense making around what was happening, what was the likely time frame for it, how worried should we all be, what were the kind of risks that we were all supposed to kind of encounter, certainly for some of us will have spent the pandemic kind of working from home with all the challenges that brought, but some of you will have been out and about in communities with the kind of risks that entailed as well, and the kind of uncertainties of kind of not really knowing what you were encountering and what kind of risks you were putting yourself through. So I think there's a whole kind of shift perhaps in thinking about leadership. Who were the kind of leaders in your local area who you thought did that well, were able to kind of do that really difficult leadership task of helping people do the sense making for a story where we didn't know when it was going to end, we didn't know how long it was going to last, we didn't know how difficult it was going to be for us, each of us personally. So I think some different kinds of skills came to the fore therefore as part of it. So some of that, it was about storytelling, as I just said. Some of it was around that kind of very agile resource weaving. Who have we got who's got a particular kind of skill who can work in a different kind of way? So, we had people who'd been working in the leisure centre who, through a skills audit, it was identified that they had good customer and community service skills, so they were out supplying PPE, doing some of that kind of community hub work. So thinking about our kind of staff team and their skills in different kinds of ways. And there was something very entrepreneurial in the sense of kind of needing to work quickly, to be creative, particularly maybe in that early phase where the usual sign-off processes were perhaps set aside, and kind of recognizing that's maybe not appropriate for kind of business as usual, but were there maybe some things that could have been learned through that we don't need to go back to. There was something different about the sense of place. So many of you currently today will be working from home, will be spending more time in your neighborhood. Others will be kind of making sense of a new kind of way of working in which you're back in the office, but maybe you're not seeing the people you used to see in the office, or maybe you get into the office and there's no one else there, or maybe you're trying to have a Zoom call, but actually everyone sitting around you is also having a Zoom call. So the kind of sense of your workplace and how to make that work for you is really very different as well. And then I think the particular kind of pressure around resilience, because we are now into getting towards this the third year, and it's been a kind of crisis in which has had many different times and periods and features, and we've gone really straight from the pandemic into the cost of living crisis, and the kind of some of the challenges of living through winter that many of the communities that you work with will be facing. So the kind of sense of kind of having to endure, I think, is something that is really people are kind of potentially struggling with. That home working can increase a sense of isolation, that it can create a need to be having kind of conversations, quite difficult conversations, without your staff team there to chat to you afterwards, doing it on your own kitchen table. That's a very different kind of potentially set of challenges. And so the sense that the kind of leadership in this space is about self-care and boundaries, and about kind of maintaining some of that trust that, there's a lot of discussion about, do we need to get everybody back in the office because actually we don't trust you, and if we can't see you, then somebody's going to come around and check if you're sitting at your desk. Well, I think for many organizations, it'd be nice to kind of feel like we've moved beyond that into a place where we can kind of trust staff and we understand what works well and is appropriate to do from home, and what maybe is the benefit of kind of coming together in the office. And so there's a sense then of kind of, where does this leave us long term? What are our kind of, if we've kind of gone past, we're in the kind of living with COVID, era, this sense of kind of things that were possible when the adrenaline was flowing. You know, how do we kind of maintain what was good about it? How do we keep working cultures that feel like they're less about kind of presence and they're more about kind of what can we achieve where and when, without overloading and eroding our kind of self-care? Do we still remember that conversation around inequalities that was kind of foregrounded in during the pandemic, and about recognizing the way in which the effects of the pandemic were felt very differently in different communities, and by people working in different sectors? So are we still kind of thinking about that conversation within our organizations, and a sense that we're still living in this era in which financial constraints are very intense, and in some local authorities are really kind of existential in terms of being able to kind of keep the lights on? So how do we think about what we've learned from COVID, but recognizing that those constraints are still very much real and very much with us? So the final pause point then is really just about kind of what we can learn from this phase. So what are we still doing differently that we learned and we valued, and what can be kind of retained and built on, and maybe what are the risks, if things that we're slipping back into? So again, I'll just pause for a minute or two to give you some thinking time. Thanks, Dion.
Hi. I think we've been talking about it a bit today, but the agility has been, and that I think it demonstrated our ability to actually radically change how we deliver services almost overnight, which probably in the sector we hadn't quite ever anticipated we could achieve that level of change. The agility that's come with that is a real positive by and large. One of the challenges that has probably been retained as a consequence is that you can be called into meetings at a minute's notice, no matter where you are, and what. So that sense that you possibly, in some ways, have less control over your time because people anywhere have access to your calendar and just put meetings. Or maybe, I don't think it's just me, but yeah, that seems to be an experience that's not so positive.
And Dion, what would be some examples of things that have changed permanently in the service?
I think in terms of what's been said about just how people work between the home and the office, and everything about that is very different. So people being able to try and maintain more of a sense, in a way, about home-life balance, home-life work balance, sorry. And although for some people, I think it's possibly gone to the extreme of saying, no, we do want to leave and prioritize family and so on. And everything that you described about what it feels like to go into the office now, and having probably experienced every level of that at different phases. But I think not all organizations are in the same place either. So what's working well in one organization, in a different organization, that wouldn't work for them in the same way.
Yeah, thanks, Dion. So I think there's sort of two strands then, aren't there? Sort of how are we working differently in terms of sort of supporting communities and families, and then there's the kind of question of how are our own kind of work lives changed and for the better. So I guess it'd be good to hear from people about kind of either of those questions. Ashley.
But perhaps slightly different. I think one of the things from the pandemic is that it actually helped build relationships across the system, because I think people worked very quickly, very closely together. And I don't just mean practitioners. I mean, you use the example of a leisure centre manager, but but also with communities, voluntary sector groups. I think relationships generally are better post-COVID than they were before, because I think it just forced people to be open and honest about certain things. And I think that there's a bit of a legacy there, which hopefully is positive, because I think people got to know each other much better because of the circumstances. As I said, not just practitioners, but also people in the community, parents. I think people know each other better, and hopefully that's a positive legacy.
Yeah, that's really interesting from a system point of view. Thanks, Ashley. Kevin.
Yeah, I'm probably going to throw a bit of a spanner in the works, but I've said this comment before in another session. But what we find with ASYEs, like newly qualified social workers, is that quite a lot of them, their final year placement was in social work, so they've not even done a home visit before. They've not managed a difficult conversation over the phone. So fundamentally, their ASYE year means them being in the office and listening to other people's conversations and how they deal with things, having an opportunity to shadow and observe. And with the way Kent's adapted, we've given flexible working and people working from home more than they're in the office. It's meant that the pool of ASYEs doesn't have the same level of skill as they would have done pre-COVID. And what we've also seen is that during COVID, social workers became senior practitioners became team managers, and they've only had that experience within COVID. And now they're going back to normal in terms of trying to get face-to-face things. They're really struggling to adapt. And actually, they haven't managed meetings face-to-face. They've gone on the screen where people turn the cameras off, and now they're sitting in front of 10, 15 people for the first time. So that the skill, it's not even about becoming de-skilled. They never develop the skill. And then, and what we're finding now is we're having to bridge the gap in the practice wisdom that people don't have, which they would have had if it was pre-COVID. So whilst you've got the things about new opportunities, I think it's come at a cost. And actually, you've got senior leaders having to do more visibility activity than ever, and more engagement and going down to lower levels to try and build that, to share that practice wisdom, to get everyone's skill set to do what they're supposed to do, what they should have learned to do. So I think we definitely adapted to give more flexible working, but I think it's come at cost. And the digital strategy, we've embraced it, but again, it's meant that we've got workers that we've employed never met before, face to face, and we're trying to build a team ethos and really celebrate diversity. It's difficult; we can't see each other. It's more difficult, I think, than having a Teams meeting or a Zoom call.
And is there something there, Kevin, about people that kind of developing that practical wisdom, practice wisdom, about kind of not seeing senior colleagues or not listening to senior colleagues being on the phone, not watching, and kind of learning through being in a kind of a busy, open team?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go into the office and I'll sit with the workers and I'll be in a meeting with cabinet members. They can see me talking about some of the strategies. And that's what I've tried to do, not just through talking to staff, but modelling as well. And service managers and team managers are going back into working with practitioners. But the more senior experienced practitioners don't have time to come into the office because they've got caseloads so high, they're not coming in. So managers and leaders are having to do more and more modelling to try and bridge the gap, because the practitioners need to be out there with high caseloads visiting people. So I think it's the same for all parts of business, like early help, open access, education. I think they're all trying to engage with schools, especially with academies increasing, and they don't want to have our support because that's the function of an academy. We're getting less and less visibility and oversight, and things are becoming more invisible. So we're trying to breach that gap of visibility without being there, sort of thing. So how do you get the information you used to get from visiting schools and co-locating and things like that? It's all disappearing really, and it's hard to replace.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's really important about what's being lost. Johnny.
Hi, Catherine. Thanks. I think this is a really, really, really fundamental question here, and it really deserves. I'm pleased that you've asked here, because I think there's still this binary kind of discussion about whether you work from home or come into the office, and then you start getting into, well, but what the question's more framed around, I think what you've tried to frame here is about actually, do we need to examine the way that we work now, whether that's at home or whether that's in the office or whether it's in the field? And, you know, I was talking to a colleague the other day, and we were talking about how once upon a time, there was such a nice vibe in the floor that we were working on, because just by seeing people in other departments that you don't even work with, just saying hello to people, just the atmosphere of the workplace was just really positive. You can't really get that by everybody working at home. There's loads of positive things around the pandemic, the use of technology, being able to jump into a meeting really quickly, and do things in that way. But sorry, I've got a lot of background noise going on there. But I think what's happened is because the conversation has become too binary, we're just saying, should you be in, should you be at home? And then what we would end up doing is we were coming into the office and working exactly the same way in the office as we were at home. So then you think, well, there's no point me driving to the office and spending 8 o'clock in the morning till 5 on Teams meetings, because I'm still not interacting with anybody. I'm still not doing anything different. So I guess it's about just trying to think, well, if we are bringing people in, why are we bringing them in, and what are they going to do that's different from them staying at home? And I did read an article that one company said, they said that they've asked people to come in on certain days, but on those certain days, they're not allowed to use technology. They're not allowed to get, you know, and it's just that kind of thinking, what are we going to do that's different? And I think that's the way the conversation needs to be framed, to try and really get the best of both worlds, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Johnny. I think that's absolutely right. But yeah, just coming in to be on Teams all day is really not what it's about. Is anyone working somewhere where they've kind of doing this well? I know some local authorities have got that kind of come in with a purpose sense of kind of, we'll have time in the office, but it will be time when it's actually face-to-face, meeting the team, working together. Does anyone kind of feel like their organisation's kind of doing that well currently? Joe?
Yeah, I guess just following on from what Johnny said, I think I work in Lincolnshire, which geographically is massive and takes hours to get from one end to the other. So in terms of, you know, from a senior leadership point of view, some of the visibility stuff has been really helpful. And now we always used to do sort of the senior leadership briefings where we drive around the county. Now we can do that on Teams and see a lot of people and on a regular basis and things. So that sort of has worked really well. But I think the point that Johnny made about coming into the office and then doing the same as what you did at home, we've kind of prioritised and agreed as a kind of wider directorate leadership team, which are our really important meetings that we want to do face to face. And if you can't come, you don't come, you send apologies, or you send somebody else. You don't have a hybrid meeting where someone dials in and then there's the tendency to think, oh, well, I won't go in, I'll dial in because it's easier. So really sort of, a joint agreement to do it. It hasn't been a kind of imposed thing, but a collective view that actually everybody feels better when you've been in and have those conversations that are face-to-face, not via Teams. And so across the sort of leadership team and then across our managers, looking at prioritising those, and then across the wider council, similar's happened. So agreeing which are the ones where actually we just all need to be in a room. And if you can't be there, there'll be times you can't be, but you just don't come. And so having productive conversations. Our buildings are open, everybody can be in if they want to be. Certain teams, we've done a bit more, I guess, encouragement, and they're the kind of, if you like, those teams that work directly with children and families where we feel they need that support and relationships and stuff. So there's been a lot of engagement with staff around what do they want, what works, what doesn't, and some political battles, I think, around a view that if politicians can't see you, then clearly you must be sat with your feet up. But I think we've started to overcome some of those now, and just being left to get on with it and trying to focus on outcomes and outputs, outcomes rather than whether you're physically in a building or not, but making the best use of each other's interactions, really, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I think you're right. That point about trust is so important. Yeah, I think that the issue about hybrid meetings, let's hope the legacy of the pandemic is not lots of hybrid meetings, because they certainly, from my experience, very clunky. Fiona.
Yeah, it's similar to what Joe said. So I work for Norfolk County Council, so again, geographically, it's a very big spread even across the county. But we've got a lot of our senior leadership team that don't actually live in Norfolk. So I travel from Bristol and go up once a month. We've got directors that live in London. So actually quite a lot of our senior leadership team aren't local, but that means that when we do those face-to-face meetings, we have to do the planning for them to make sure actually there is a benefit of people coming face to face, and there's some planning around it, and we know what it is that we're doing and what we want to achieve. We've not quite done the same as what Joe was describing, in that we do those as hybrids, but it's hybrid by exception. So we expect people to be there face to face unless there is kind of exceptional circumstances that mean they can't be, and we give enough notice for any of those face to face meetings so that they can be organized. But it works. We've not really had too many issues with it, I think, because they're kind of used to working in that way because of the geography of the county. It's helped everybody, I think.
Thanks, Fiona. Yeah, so I think, real sense that there are some real challenges here about how we maintain a sense of kind of a team and shared purpose and the kind of energy and community that we get from work, but doing it in a way that is not kind of overloading us in terms of the kind of expectations. And I think Dion's initial point about suddenly people can be putting things in our diary all the time, and that there are some issues around how we kind of retain the boundaries when we kind of have this online presence. So we will leave it there for the session. Just a little bit of a picture of my colleague Catherine's dog and a little bit of contact info. So we are doing, as I said, a bit of a kind of a refresher of some of this. So we'll hopefully be tweeting about that as the year goes on, about kind of where things are at. When we first started out on this research, we did a blog. Now we're just not sure if people have got time to read blogs anymore. Like, do we just need to be doing like little Instagram reels or TikToks or something like that? So that's kind of just thinking about how the world is moving on and how we communicate things. But for now, we'll be kind of doing stuff on Twitter. And we'd love to just hear the sorts of things you're up to. So thanks very much for your time today, and I'll hand back to Mike.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And I will hand straight on to Nisha just to say a few words on behalf of the group.
Thanks, Mike. Catherine, thank you for sharing your research and reflections with us today, and engaging in very thoughtful discussions about some very critical and hot topics. I personally love the visuals in your presentation. It appeals to my learning style, and I'm sure it would do for all my colleagues here on call today. And we're all facing some very, very long-standing and common challenges. And I really like the term you use, perma-austerity, COVID, cost of living. And we've heard this morning in our morning session that there is really no clear blueprint for DCS role. But this discussion today, I found it very helpful to be able to bring together a set of skills, resources, strategies that we would need to keep in mind as we perform in our current roles and progress to whatever leadership roles we might choose in future. And I'm sure that this discussion that we've had today in the last 1 hour of the session, it won't end here today, because we've talked about the characteristics, skills, behaviors that will need more careful reflection and planning to develop. So thank you on behalf of our whole group. Thank you very much for your time.